Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and it's time for part 8 of my Rastakhan's card review. 5 new cards this time around, including 2 new legendaries. If you don't have a lot of time, hit the quick reviews link in the description to check out my 5-star ratings. Otherwise, let's jump into the detailed reviews. So up first, let's talk about Wardruid Loti, the troll champion for Druid, 3 mana 1/2, and it has choose one, transform into one of Loti's 4 dinosaur forms. And those forms are a 1/6 with taunt, a 4/2 with rush, a 1/4 with spell damage +1, and a 1/2 with poisonous and stealth. So Loti is like this ultimately flexible kind of Swiss Army knife sort of minion. And that's kind of neat for Druid, right? In a pinch, it can be whatever you need it to be. And if you look at each of these individually, like they all just look like normal sort of cards. Clearly, they're not great in any given scenario. I guess the Poisonous Stealth is favorable to like Stone Skin Basilisk, but most of them aren't better than normal looking cards. The upside for something like this, I think, instead is the fact that they can be what you need them to be when you need them to be. So for instance, if you have a swipe and you just really need spell damage, drop Wardruid Loti and your swipe gets upgraded. If you have to kill a 4 health minion on turn 3, she can be a rush 4/2. If you're desperately dying against tokens and you need a taunt with 1 attack, there you go, she can be a 1/6. And then if your opponent's going to drop like a mountain giant on turn 3 or 4, drop her with poisonous and stealth to deny that big minion play. So there are ways to play this both on curve and off where it still becomes useful. I do wonder though, are there going to be scenarios where it just never lines up where she does anything good? Because none of these minions in and of themselves are that great or impactful or scary, or awesome. So I wonder if it's going to be a dead card in hand as much as it's going to be a useful card in hand. I think that can be the risk for the Swiss Army knife is like, yeah, in a pinch it feels good, but never feels great as like a proactive sort of thing to play out. That's going to be the challenge. Now, I will note too, real quickly, there is a Fandral Staghelm version of Wardruid Loti. Fandral says you choose one effect, so you get both. In that case, you get all 4 of these. They all get bundled into one big thing, which is pretty sick. It's cool. I'll let you watch the Kriparian reveal video for that. But ultimately, the challenge for Loti is, that phrase, and we were going to go through this again in the comments, I'm sure. Jack of all trades, master of none. Some of you will say that's not really the full phrase. Other people will come back and say, actually, it is the full phrase. And the reality is I've looked it up. Nobody knows where it started or what the full phrase is. But anyway, let's use it in its base form. Jack of all trades, master of none. That might be the problem for Loti, where the flexibility is almost more of a hindrance than a help. But there could still be a deck that utilizes it as just kind of that flex minion, because there are a lot of those just kind of druid decks where there's just tons of cards. And with swipes in particular for a spell damage minion like this, I think that's kind of valuable and it does serve a purpose or a need. So I think Loti is a card that has the chance to be played. It's not going to be the star of druid ever in my mind, but a solid card nonetheless. So now let's talk about Akali the Rhino, the Loa for Warrior. This is an 8 mana 5/5 beast with rush. It also has overkill. Draw a rush minion from your deck and then give that rush minion +5/+5. So Akali the Rhino, a little bit understated for an 8 drop, but he can hit the board and make an immediate impact thanks to that rush. And then if you're able to successfully overkill, then you're going to get another card that can immediately impact the board. And in fact, a card that's going to have a ton of extra stats. So there are clearly some cool big things happening here. And in fact, if you build your deck correctly with cards like, say, Vicious Scalehide, there's some other cheap rush minions, you might be able to play both of those in a single turn. So drop your 5/5 Akali and then get a Vicious Scalehide that has +5/+5. So it'd be a 6/8 Vicious Scalehide with lifesteal, and then that trades into a second minion and you heal and you're left maybe with a couple medium-sized dudes where you've made a nice little swingy board state because they both were able to attack immediately. That's the perfect scenario for Akali, and in those scenarios I think that's a reasonably good play. The challenge for this card for me is that I don't think those perfect scenarios are going to line up all that well, all that often. First off, as a 5 attack minion for Akali here, there are a lot of late game board states where it's going to be hard for Akali to achieve that overkill. Now, one important thing to note is Akali doesn't have to survive to achieve the overkill. So, he could die or trade into a minion that had been damaged a little bit already and still get you that card draw, which could be impactful. Maybe get a big Zilliax for the next turn, right? A big 8/7 with lifesteal's pretty good too if you're just looking to bank a big play for later. But then have you done enough the turn you've played Akali? So although it is a card that makes a direct and immediate impact on the board, I'm not sure it's a big enough impact. And then that +5/+5 is nice for later, but then is that a big enough impact? By the time you're in turn 8 of a game, you're often looking to play cards that are like winning you the game or just really doing big things. And I don't know that Akali is that finishing piece, or the crown jewel of a deck. It feels more like kind of a just mid-rangey or a late mid-range minion that maybe isn't that threatening or that scary. Even a card like Darius Crowley, right? It's another legendary rush minion for Warrior that, involves getting some extra stats. The cool thing about Darius Crowley is, first off, he's turn 5 instead of turn 8. So much faster card as far as mana is concerned. But also, if you don't deal with him, he just snowballs into this really intimidating force. He could eventually get to 12 attack or something. Akali never has that same threat or that same snowball. There's a kind of cap on what Akali can actually do just based on these two cards. So even if you get a couple overkill attacks with Akali, if he attacks and he hangs around on board and he's able to overkill a second time, even then, if you've done enough, right? That's nice. 2 extra minions. They've got an extra +5/+5, but it still doesn't feel like it's got quite enough oomph. So I'm not saying Akali is terrible. Clearly, when you play this, you're going to feel solid about it. I'm just not sure this is the kind of card Warrior's looking for most of the time. Whether that's in a mid-rangey rush deck like we've seen, this feels a little bit too slow and non-threatening. If it was a 7/7, I think we'd be in a much different conversation. But as a 5/5, it's going to be hard to use sometimes at turn 8. And if it was 7 mana or 6 mana, it would feel a lot better too, because you'd have more mana for those rush minions. You could fit in more, Worgans, for instance, that are 3 mana instead of only a couple of the 2 mana less packaged cards. So Akali just looks a tad awkward. Now, there will be a spirit for Warrior revealed. Maybe that's going to explain some of what this card can do, but the card still has to be reviewed and assessed on its own merits as well. It's its own card. You won't always have a spirit for it. So for me, Akali, a tad disappointing. I was really looking forward to this card, but I'm not yet seeing exactly why he's going to be that powerful or that impactful. So just an okay card. Moving on, let's talk about the Crowd Roaster, a 7 mana, 7/4 neutral dragon. The battle cry reads, if you're holding a dragon, deal 7 damage to an enemy minion. So we have, essentially kind of a single target removal minion here. It's a bit reminiscent to things like maybe Vile Spine Slayer almost, or Blaze Caller, this, more mid to late game card that is intended to kill a thing and deposit a body on board, making a swingy sort of play. But I actually think it's much worse than both of those examples I cited. Clearly much worse than Vile Spine Slayer for 2 reasons. One, it's 7 mana instead of 5. Also, 7 damage dealt to an enemy minion is not always going to secure the kill on things like Lich King. So it's not this universal removal like Vile Spine Slayer is. Ysera's and Malagos and Alexstrasza's and Lich Kings don't die to Crowd Roaster. In fact, he doesn't really do all that much to them at all. So I think it's going to be hard to utilize this as your core single target removal piece. Also, it's just 7 mana is a lot harder to work with because you can't flex in other things in the same turn. And then when you compare this to something like Blaze Caller, first off, Blaze Caller is not even that successful of a card. It's been played a little bit here and there, but this can't go face. Blaze Caller can go face, which is sometimes really impactful. Also, Blaze Caller has 6/6 in stats instead of 7/4, which is just more total, first off, but also I think that 6 health is a big difference. 4 health, very easy to be killed by smaller things and smaller boards. Lots of weapons kill 4 health minions. So Crowd Roaster looks to me a little worse than some comparable variants there. That said, that doesn't necessarily mean he's bad, so we should just talk about him himself. 7/4 stat line you might say, oh, there's so much attack and so little health, that's risky. It is, but 7 attack is a threatening amount. If your opponent can't deal with it, maybe you can trade into the next big thing as well, right? So there is some potential where this lives, it trades up nicely and you don't feel too bad. And then, in those scenarios where you kill that 7 health minion, and I'll note there are a lot of extra 7 health minions being added to the game in Rastakhan's Rumble. The minions we see as threats right now may not be the minions we see as threats in the future, because there's just so many new 7 health ones. So maybe Crowd Roaster's there to, create those opportunities to kill those. And it'll feel good to play this card often, I think. The challenge will be it probably won't feel good to run it in your deck. In other words, off of, random dragon generation, when you get this from your Bone Drake, it's going to be a pretty exciting card to see, I think, a lot of the time. You'll be like, oh yeah. But I doubt it'll actually make the cut in most constructed lists. Clearly a great arena card, I'm sure, too, because 7 damage and swinging the board is awesome in an arena. 4 attacks harder to do in arena, to the minion. But in constructed, one of those cards that's fine. It does something good, but it's not likely good enough to make the cut in my mind. There are better alternatives out there for dragon decks in that mid to late game slot. Most decks have removal tools. They won't need this as single target removal. So falling just a little bit short, even though I think I'm more people like this card more regularly than I do. But to me, still just not quite there. So now let's talk about Stampeding Roar for Druid, a new 6-mana spell. Read summon a random beast from your hand and give it Rush. So we've got ourselves, sort of a big Druid cheat out card here, essentially, where you're able to play a really big thing maybe for less mana than you should be able to. And in fact, you're also giving that thing Rush. So yeah, if you are able to hit Tyrantus with Stampeding Roar, you get a 12/12 that can't be targeted, that can instantly take a trade into the board. And that's a really good sort of thing to do. There are lots of other big beasts available in Hearthstone as well. So there are cards to utilize with this thing, both in Druid and in the neutral set. So it has some use cases, right? Tyrantus, prime among them, but it certainly has some use cases. You could even use this for Hadronox, for instance, to maybe make your Hadronox a little easier to kill without Naturalize, because giving it Rush means it can trade in. Although at 7 health, Hadronox can be hard to kill. Not all board states have a 7 attack minion that you can run your Hadronox into, but another thing to consider. I do think this is really more about like a kind of big Druid deck use case where you're cheating out big things that your opponent just can't answer. Now, the question for me with a card like this, though, is the fact that Druid is really, really good with ramp. They're so good at getting their mana at higher mana totals that cards like Stampeding Roar here, which are discounts to things that allow you to cheat out minions earlier, aren't as impactful in a class like Druid maybe as they might be in other classes, because Druid's already good at cheating things out early because they just have way more mana than they're supposed to. There are obviously still tempo implications. Even if you did ramp to 10 faster and you were able to play Stampeding Roar, you might have spare mana left over. So it's not like it's useless because there's ramp. It's just maybe less exciting for Druid than it would be in other classes. The other issue for a card like Stampeding Roar is you do have to have the minion in hand. So you have to have some card draw to support something like Stampeding Roar. Druid, of course, has lots of card draw, but if you're playing for more of a sort of pressure or minion-based game plan, maybe you're playing minions out more consistently throughout the game, and you don't necessarily have exactly what you need in hand. Also, it has to be a beast, so lots of big stuff just doesn't work with Stampeding Roar. Can you build a Druid synergy deck with enough beasts to make a card like this impactful? Lots of questions to answer as far as how to make this thing work, but at the end of the day, just speaking on a fundamental level, the card does something cool and has opportunities to make big plays. So I do think this card has some viability. I don't really see the Druid deck for it tomorrow, right? I don't think there's going to be an instant deck in Rastakhan's Rumble for this card, but that doesn't make it bad. It just means it's going to take a while to get played if it finds play at all, but it still does something good. The rush aspect in particular, I think, makes this card safer to play than it would be if it didn't have that. That'd be really hard. But when it has rush, that means you're not really passing up the opportunity to influence the board right away. So all that said, Stampeding Roar looks like a solid card. And then finally, we have Master's Call for Hunter, the elusive, the unheard of Hunter card draw. 3-mana spell, discover a minion in your deck. If all 3 are beasts, draw them all. So this is a bit of a weird wording. It kind of actually confused me when I first read it. So you're just discovering 3 options, like always, and they will be minions from your deck. And if all three of those options are beasts, you don't pick one, you just draw all three. You get all three beasts added to your hand. If they're not all beasts, presumably you still get to pick one and it still gets added to your hand, and presumably it's drawn, not a copy. Most discover effects that discover a copy specify that it's a copy. So it's a bit like a mix between tracking, but a tracking that doesn't discard the options you don't choose, and a tracking that would add all three to your hand if they're beasts. So in that scenario where all three are beasts, Master's Call is obviously ridiculous. A 3-mana draw 3 is really, really strong. That's exactly the sort of card draw you want, where it doesn't influence your tempo too much because it's fairly cheap at 3 mana, but it's giving you a lot of resources to work with in future turns. And obviously Hunter has lots of cool beasts they might want to draw off of something like this, and even more coming. So Undastas are there, Charged Devil Swords, and King Crushes, and Savannah Highmanes, so on and so forth. The one challenge for a card like Master's Call is that if you have those beasts, you may not get beast support cards for them. Like, for instance, you can't run Houndmasters if you want to draw all three, because then the Houndmasters are not beasts. They get mixed up in your Master's Call draw, and you don't get your 3 cards. And that might be bad. So you have to find a deck where you're not running, Katharina or Houndmaster. You're just running beasts. And I think there are some mid-range Hunter lists that can achieve that. So I don't know that that's a big problem for the card. That's just not going to make it work in every deck as well. But that said, I actually don't know that Master's Call is that bad, even if you do have non-beasts in your deck. It's basically a tracking that doesn't discard your additional resources in that scenario, right? A tracking for a minion, which can be better or worse depending on the scenario, but it's a tutored, specified tracking. And that's kind of cool. So if you have one really big clutch thing, you could actually get Katharina, for instance, off of your Master's Call. And that might be worth it just to draw Katharina. If you have a few mana to spare on a turn anyway, it's not like it's that much more of a tempo punishment over tracking. It's just a couple extra mana. You know, it's clearly not as flexible as tracking, which is a problem, but still reasonable enough at 3 mana. It's not like it's a 5 mana commitment. You can just go pick your Katharina and have that Katharina added to your hand. And yeah, you sacrifice the 2 additional cards, but it's still that sort of stitch tracker style where you're just finding that thing you need and yanking it out of your deck. So I don't know that this is only ever run in a beast exclusive deck. It might still be decent outside of that, especially if you're playing a deck that cares about fatigue, where tracking might be less relevant. And most of the time you'd pick tracking still in those scenarios, but if it's a minion exactly and fatigue matters to you, Master's Call could be a better alternative. So clearly in the scenario where this works, it's an insane amount of card draw. In the scenario where it doesn't work perfectly, it's still a neat little tutor card. And I think that's important. It's a really, really good option for Hunter. Most people are going absolutely crazy about this card. I will say the one maybe downside I don't think a lot of people have considered, or that I haven't heard people talking about, is the fact that in a lot of cases when you draw a ton of cards, you're hoping those cards can influence the game quickly. So, you know, if you think about like Arcane Intellect or maybe like Sprint and Rogue, they're often drawing spells or cheap tempo cards that they can infuse into the board right away. So, you know, they're drawing maybe burst damage for Maze. They're drawing fireballs to just win him the game. You know, Rogue is drawing eviscerates and backstabs and preps so they can do things quickly. The one issue with drawing 3 beasts from your deck is it's more of a resource accrual thing and not like a lifesaver or a board swing sort of scenario, because most beasts are just played out. Like, yeah, if they have rush, there are ways to mitigate that a little bit, or if they have lifesteal or taunt, there's certainly ways to make them immediately impactful. But sometimes it's just going to be about generating those resources, and it may not be enough to get you back into the game like other instances of card draw. So the deck's still going to have to support it in that way too. A deck that maybe needs to play from ahead a little bit as far as playing from behind, because this is never going to be the card that like saves you in a pinch when you're behind. So it is a different kind of card draw in a deck that's never really had card draw before. So there are some things to line up to make sure it all works together. But ultimately, a card that draws you 3 for 3, that's a strong card. It also tutors sometimes. That's a strong card. So Master's Call is a strong card. There you go. That wraps it up for the detailed reviews. Now we'll jump into the quick reviews. Wardruid Loti is a 3-star card. Akali the Rhino is a 3-star card. Crowd Roaster is a 2-star card. Stampeding Roar is a 3-star card. Master's Call is a 4-star card. All right, guys, part 8 is done. Some interesting cards here. The legendaries weren't as exciting as I'd hoped them to be. They were solid cards. I think they have some playability, but they're not those like star standout cards, but some neat little utility tools there for Druid and Hunter as well. So some exciting stuff to play around with. I'm curious how all this is going to work, and I'm sure I'm going to get some hate for crowd roasters, so let me know about that, what you think there. That said, if you do have other thoughts or questions or observations, whatever it might be, share those in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.